Hi, this is Mehdi,
Hey, this is Fran.
and this is Total Tactics Football. Today's podcast is going to be based around the topic about the authorizing of sale by FIFA for under 16s from the Brazilian football market to the European one. This is based on the comments from the president of the Brazilian Football Confederation, Caboclo. Fran, in this segment, I wanted to sort of discuss with you the sort of repercussions of this potential deal, the sort of trafficking in a sense that occurs in today's market already, and what that's going to mean for transfers going forward.
Yeah, so I think as you mentioned, the kind of Brazilian chief of FA mentioned that that was something he was strictly against FIFA with, and actually the ramifications are that it would be worldwide in the sense that all non-European clubs would therefore have their kind of under 16 plus or their under 18 players up to the age of 16 be allowed to be transferred to Europe, and that's obviously a shift from the present rule where it's under 18 and you already have signed and perhaps played a few years of professional football at a top flight league in a, let's say, African or South American country. And what happens now, of course, is if this rule does kind of become authorized and legalized, then you have the worry that a lot of these kind of domestic leagues would struggle to kind of hold the transfer fees that they've been kind of taking. So if you look at kind of big Brazilian transfers, I think in recent years, we're talking, let's say someone like Everton to Benfica, who's a bit more of a pronounced player. But in terms of young talent, Neymar, Rodrigo, Vinicius, these are all players who had played at least a year in the Brazilian top flight, and they got to show their kind of skills on stage, and obviously that kind of inspired a much larger transfer fee for these players. But what we're talking about now is that if 17-year-olds, 16-year-olds can be transferred, we're saying that basically effectively without having played professional football, I think these European clubs who obviously have a lot more money than the kind of domestic clubs in Europe and in Africa and South America can much more easily be ransacked. And I think there's questions that can be raised in terms of the effects of football trafficking. And to give an example, I think a more recent one, a player like Amad Diallo, who just joined Manchester United, scored a debut goal for them as well. I mean, he was another instance of a player who had kind of illegally found a way into Italy through these kind of connections that he had kind of ascertained as he was trying to make his way into Europe. And of course, when you look at the circumstances of some families, some coming from more destitute situations, we're talking about people who might not have a good grasp of the domestic language that they're moving to in Europe, and they don't have the kind of connections and understandings of how to kind of make sure that everything they're doing is legal, that their children are being taken care of, and it's a very risky situation and a very murky one where I think so. In the instance of the Italian FA, they had fined Amad Diallo £42,000, and now when you look back, I mean, there's no way a young kid could have orchestrated something like this. It's very clear that there are kind of third parties within the football market that are clearly acting, in a very illegitimate manner and operating through illegitimate kind of services and posing as agents. And this has kind of been a well-pronounced issue since I think the early 2000s. But the implication of younger kids being now transferable in a sense to European clubs means that the risk is even higher, I think, and it's very scary, I think.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, just let's look at the situation in Brazil itself. As of yesterday, there are 3,000 deaths per day due to the COVID-19 pandemic. This Brazilian Federation, Football Confederation, I was talking about that they might have to stop playing football. And the major income for these clubs comes from transfer sales and from the television income. So now when your football stops, these clubs can't receive the money that they're supposed to receive. They've been already hit with the impact of the pandemic, and in future to be able to recover, they might not even be able to make these major sales, as you mentioned, right? Just looking at Everton and Pedrinho from last year, who moved to Benfica, as you mentioned, those transfers were relatively low considering the price of Brazilian players you would often see that are moved to a European club. This is under 13 million euros. And that is just due to because Brazil's weakening position in the market itself. And to to kind of just move on from there, if you have these clubs who can't be able to use these talents and provide the sort of platform and the as you mentioned, these young players like Rodrigo and Vinicius, who at least get to play 1 year or 2 years in these competitions, if your clubs are struggling to be able to pay the prices there, these players will be looking to move. So now you lose the sort of natural talent that your country's producing. This is a country which has produced some incredible talents like Neymar's and Pele's and Ronaldinho's. These are players who've been able to play at home first and then moved out. So you're a big football market that's hungry for talent and for great sort of entertainment. They lose that themselves. They will lose the amount of entertainment that is available there, and at the same time the quality impact that's going to have on the internationals, because a lot of these young kids who move away, uh, they can get dual citizenship somewhere else. So you can have a look at the impact that applies to Brazil itself. Those players maybe might not want to feel as at home or as maybe nationalistic as one could say about, or like compassionate about their own country as they might be feel if they move at the age of 16. It has an impact on later, like we've seen with the likes of Diego Costa, who've looked to play for Spain instead. And maybe one of the biggest thing for Brazilians was the pride to be playing for their national team. And we saw that even at the World Cup when they lost, but you could see the emotions that goes behind this, because for this country that has gone through a lot in the past, football has been something that has been in the heart of the country, and that does seem to be feels like it's sort of wavering with this sort of transaction that FIFA is looking to make with the confederation. If they are successful here, it could mean that we start also losing young talents, individual talents that are coming forward. Back then, in those conditions that they play in Brazil, these players have to play against older players. They are playing in rough pitches. They have to play in environments where, without winning, nothing else matters. And in Europe, where now we have a very structured way of introducing youth into football, which is successful as a collective, but maybe you sort of lose that bit of flair or individuality of players that we've seen from South Americans that they have sort of represented when they've been playing in the big leagues in Europe. And I feel this deal could sort of take away that, as the young kids move into academies in Europe and have to sort of, you know, acclimatize to their methods of playing or their way of football. And I feel that we are now starting towards becoming, it's becoming very homogenous, it's very repetitive, it's similar, and maybe we might lose a bit of individuality there. And for me, that feels like, football is losing there.
Yeah, no, I think that's an interesting point because when you look at, let's say, a lot of the top players, I think, in the Premier League, now looking at the English national team as well, I think what's interesting is a lot of the top players who show flair, a lot of kind of technique and prowess and kind of dribbling ability, one could say as well, which are more individual traits that I think you pick up outside of the academies and something that you kind of hone in on when you play, in cage football or any kind of the street arenas. And the interesting thing, of course, is that's kind of a very common vibe and I think background for a lot of the top English players. Whereas, as you mentioned, in terms of when you look at academy football, I think it is much more organized and it's much more strict in terms of routines and perhaps even the way that you're allowed to express yourself in the field. And that, if a lot of players just start getting transferred into Europe at a younger age, then you kind of lose that sense to kind of maybe develop your individual traits. And I think similarly as well, what you're seeing in football, that we are moving into a very physical era where I think pressing is very much predicated on actual physical fitness. A lot of players have to be able to kind of meet with the demands of the game and kind of understand, where they're positioned in the pitch, more so whether they're allowed to kind of express themselves in a certain way. You have to really be so many levels above someone like Messi, for example, to kind of break these kind of fundamental rules that I think managers are now instilling on players. And yeah, I think that is a little bit of I think a worrisome sign. But I think at the same time, another thing to worry about is just what happens to players who don't make it. It's a known truth in football that I think a very small amount of players make it. You hear dozens of stories about people who make academies at a young age and fall out at, the under 15, 16, 17, 18, 19 level. And as you move up and up in the pyramid, less people start to become a part of the game. And it's worrisome for these players who kind of get dislocated from, their families, who are obviously not going to be able to move with them. And it's hard. So, for example, if I give an example of Kevin De Bruyne, who for a while I think had moved clubs in Belgium, and was actually raised by a foster family. Think about how different that's going to be for someone coming from Africa, or for someone coming from Brazil. The kind of culture clash, and also just perhaps not even understanding the same language. It's very difficult to communicate and actually find footing as well. And I worry as well, not just in terms of whether Brazilian players are able to hold up. I'm sure they are. It's more a case of whether they're going to be able to kind of meet the demands of changing everything, all their circumstances, and that's worrisome in terms of how these kids will be taken care of, and I think when you look at the FAs, it really has to be up to them to kind of alleviate the situation in some sort of way. Otherwise, we're going to deal with, once again, a lot of footballers and athletes who struggle to kind of find a way in terms of their life, in terms of moving forward, maybe if they're falling out of the game. And I think that's something that, you don't always have these kind of wonder stories like Jamie Vardy. It's more often than not, people fall out of the game and really struggle to find their footing in life. And at the same time, I think that's something that I think FAs have to start looking into.
No, you're right. I mean, even just as you mentioned about the clashes that they receive, it's when you're getting kids at the age of 16 and you're moving them in, these are kids who haven't even received their high school diplomas yet. They don't even have a basic qualification to be able to get a job. So now with these transfers, if they move in and they fail, and as we've seen last year alone, there was 2,742 Brazilians playing in Europe alone, and those numbers are obviously going to increase when there's an easier for them to be able to play in these football sort of competitions. But it's when you start seeing, as you mentioned, not everyone's going to be Jamie Vardy, not everyone's going to be able to make it. What are the sort of these safety nets for these individuals? It seems as if they will be having to risk too much compared to not be part of maybe even Brazil if they move here. If they fail, they can't even have a foothold in the country they're going to be moving to, and that seems to be very worrying. And I feel like the federations need to be looking at this the very like in precise details, because there are too many things that it seems it can allow for, as you mentioned, those third party people to be able to take advantage of these transfers. It's very easy to incite someone from a poorer country and tell them with money for to give them and offer them money from European countries, which when you convert it to their local currencies, it's huge and it's life changing. But it's different because when you have that money applied in those host countries instead of when you apply it in Europe, because £10,000 in Brazil will make a huge difference than £10,000 in Europe. So maybe a lot of times with these transfer dealings, I feel like they can go beyond clubs as well, because a lot of kids haven't signed their pro contract at the age of 16. They can at that point be sort of harvested, and there is going to definitely be, like you mentioned, we're already seeing these third party organizations or agencies that are taking advantage of this, making a lot of money on the back of this, dealing with major big clubs. And maybe it's not just the responsibility of the federation, but I feel like it's sort of the responsibility of football clubs itself to be part of this, where they need to maybe put their foot down and realize that there is got to be a certain age that they have to allow for.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think it's ultimately it's hard to kind of do the due diligence, because you can have an agent who represents a player and he can pose to be representing in good faith, but ultimately, the kind of story that is told between the young family and the club is going to be kind of through the agent, and I think in those circumstances, it's I think that there needs to be some sort of legislation in terms of what kind of agencies or agents are allowed to operate in the space in football to actually make it better for the game and better for younger athletes, so that they can actually find the right way forward in football, and at least even if they don't make it, have the opportunity to kind of be given a fair chance. And because you can hear, for example, I remember listening to a podcast recently of Callum Hudson-Odoi's brother, who's actually his agent nowadays. And it's such a different circumstance where you have a footballing background. And I think if you also look statistically amongst top players in the game, a lot of them have some sort of athletic background, or have parents who are somewhat situated in the game, and have and not a fair understanding of how to manipulate the kind of different hierarchies that you have to go through as a player coming up. And Callum Hudson-Odoi's brother was really mentioning how his own experiences in terms of being scammed. For example, he had to go to Hungary one time, and he was completely kind of frauded out in terms of what kind of contract he had signed. He wasn't paid eventually. And this also kind of really hampered his own kind of development because he wasn't able to perform for at least almost a year or even be paid for his services. And these kind of things are very commonplace. And this is someone who's coming from Europe, going out somewhere else in Europe. Think about how worse it could be for people outside of Europe. And I think, going forwards, then just needs to be much more scrutiny on that situation. I know even ironically, Sepp Blatter mentioned the kind of fear of football trafficking even as early as 2008. And so ultimately, I think, as you say, the due diligence has to be kind of put on clubs as well, who need to kind of firmly establish connections between the agents that they're dealing with. And we can see that nowadays with more clubs being a little bit more, I think, active in terms of refusing to kind of negotiate with certain agents and things like this. And moving forwards, I think the landscape just needs to kind of show a bit more appreciation for the younger talents than anyone else. But I think if we look at positives, it could be an interesting thing because we are bringing in a lot of diversity and flair and kind of, I think, a lot of culture to the game. And I think it also perhaps gives these younger players from other countries a little bit more of level footing because they now have access to better nutrition, better academies, better kind of standards, I think, in the game, just because of the vast difference in terms of money. And we've seen, of course, I think perhaps a lot of the, kind of South American or African teams struggle to produce the same level amount of talents as they used to, actually. Because I think when we look at the game now, there are perhaps less Brazilian talents than you'd expect. There are perhaps less African talents than you expect. And if you do see African talents, they've been honed, in a sense, in French academies. And I think that, of course, there's an interesting kind of documentary showing how much the French national team is impacted by migration and stuff like that. So I think that could be a positive thing for many kind of European national teams as well, and also people who want to kind of see a higher level of football too.
I think you're absolutely right on that point, that you hit it really home with the tactical side about it, and it's about how the nutrition and sort of this new tactics that are being implemented in Europe. And we've seen with the last 3 World Cups, right? Only once has a South American team been in the final. And that is due to the system that is in place in Europe. And most of those superstars that are playing in the Argentinian side were also basically playing in Europe and applying their trade at the young age in Europe. So they'd been part of the system where they've taken in the tactics, the nutritional value, and that's something that you can focus on when you have your necessities sorted out. And it's harder in Brazil because as you're poor, or like maybe in those African or South American countries where you maybe not have the chance to be able to provide the proper diet for their young players, or the right supplements that are needed, or the recovery, or those things that maybe they haven't been able to progress. It does give those kids to be able to make their careers longer, which we've seen with a lot of times with Brazilians. Their careers haven't, or the South American the careers don't tend to be as long as now the Europeans are setting through with the sports science that's available to us. And at the same time, I feel like, as you mentioned, the tactics might be the most important part. You're now playing in systems where you need to understand that it's not just about flair and individualness, but it's also utilizing that individual ability with the collective need of the team. As we're seeing, even the top players, like today, as you mentioned, with the Sanchos and Mbappe's, you've got Grealish. These are players who've got a lot of flair and some sort of skill and tenacity to themselves, but they are also applying their trade in systems, and it works together in a collectiveness, right? And there are very few players who are allowed to be able to just be free of the systems, and that we're going to start seeing less of that, I feel. And we're going to start seeing more as collectives who are going to be successful in football. Even the likes of Haaland today, he is a monster who's going to be pressing from the top. He's got the physical strength to go with it. It's just what I mean to say is that each player, even how no matter how skilled he is, has to work in a team, in a system to be able to go. And so at the age of 16, or you're able to actually learn and sort of absorb those tactics and those teachings a lot easier than it is when you're at 18 or 19. So there are a lot of there are some positives there that the young could do, but it all comes down to how this deal basically goes through, where they are able to put those safety nets for these under 16s or 16s who are going to be coming into Europe, so that they can take the benefit of it, which again goes back to their country. So if they are going to be successful, and then they can play for their own host home country, that means that they will be able to make their national team better, maybe bring that money back into their country, yet at the same time be able to play in the most exciting leagues across the world, which is the top five that we see in Europe, right? And in that element, I do see they are quite positives, and maybe due to the financial nature, that is like the financial implications of the pandemic across the globe, might be able to accelerate this deal. But maybe in that acceleration, hopefully we don't lose some of those things that we need to put in place to protect the individual players that will be looking to get affected by this possible deal.